The Arizona sun has a way of bleaching the hope from a soul leaving only dust and desperation. For Abigail Thorne, that hope had long since turned to bone-white powder. She stood on the porch of her failing ranch, the deed clutched in her hand like a death warrant, listening to the man who held her future in his sweaty palm. He wasn't offering a lifeline. He was offering a gilded cage. He promised security wealth and his name. But as she looked past his leering smile towards the distant, jagged mountains, the lands of the Apache, she knew some cages were worse than death. This is the story of how a woman offered a world she didn't want, found a love she never believed existed in the heart of a man the world had tried to destroy. The air in the Arizona Territory of 1883 was thick enough to taste. It was a gritty cocktail of dust, sun-scorched pine, and the ever-present scent of failure that seemed to cling to the warped timbers of the Thorne Ranch. Abigail, her once bright calico dress, faded to the color of a tired sky, stood gripping the porch rail until her knuckles were white stones. Before her, sitting too comfortably in her father's favorite chair, was Jedediah Kane. Kane was a man carved from greed and gristle. His wealth, amassed through ruthless cattle drives and shadowy land acquisitions, had made him the uncrowned king of the territory. His face was a fleshy map of self-satisfaction, his eyes small and shrewd, missing nothing, especially not the way the threadbare fabric of Abigail's dress pulled tight across her shoulders. "It's a simple proposition," Abigail Kane said, his voice a low rumble that grated on her nerves. He gestured with a fat ringed finger at the parched land stretching out before them. "The double tea is finished. Your father Elias, bless his sentimental heart, can't pull water from a stone. The creeks run dry, the cattle are bone racks, and his credit in town is worth less than a dead rattlesnake." Every word was a hammer blow of truth. Abigail had watched her father, a man once, as sturdy as the oaks by the river, wither into a husk of a man. His eyes were haunted, his hands trembled, and he spent his evenings staring into a whiskey glass as if searching for answers at the bottom. "I'm offering you a way out," Kane continued, leaning forward, the leather of the chair groaning in protest. "I'll absorb your father's debt. I'll merge this land with my own. Elias can live out his days in comfort. And you will become Mrs. Jedediah Kane." The title felt like a shroud. Abigail's stomach churned. She was 22 but felt a century old. Her dreams of a life built on mutual affection and respect had long ago been burned away by the harsh realities of their decline. She had suitors, once handsome young men, with calloused hands and honest smiles, but her father had chased them all away, his paranoia and temper growing with each passing season. Now the only one left was the vulture. "And if I refuse?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Kane's smile didn't falter, but a coldness crept into his eyes. "Then the bank forecloses. Elias will be disgraced, thrown off the land his father built. You'll have nothing. You'll be a charity case, Abigail, or worse. A woman alone in this territory. Well, there are fates crueler than being my wife." He stood, his bulk blocking out the setting sun, casting a long, oppressive shadow that engulfed her completely. He reached out and brushed a thumb against her cheek. His touch was clammy, possessive. She flinched as if stung. "You have until the end of the week," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur. "Don't be a fool. There's no one else coming to save you." He tipped his expensive hat and walked to his waiting buggy, his boots kicking up clouds of the dust that was choking the life from her home. Abigail remained on the porch, trembling not from fear, but from a profound and suffocating rage. He was right. Her father was broken. Their legacy was in ashes, and she was trapped. As the buggy disappeared down the rutted road, Her gaze was drawn again to the distant Dragoon Mountains. They were jagged purple teeth against the bleeding sky. Apache land, or what was left of it. People in the town of Tombstone spoke of them in hushed, fearful tones. Savages, ghosts, especially one. A name that was whispered like a curse, a warrior who had refused the reservation, who haunted the canyons like a phantom of vengeance. Nantan Lupan, the Grey Wolf. They said he was the last of his line, a man whose family had been wiped out, and that his heart was as hard and cold as the mountain stone. Looking at those mountains, Abigail felt a strange, desperate kinship. She too felt like the last of her line, trapped in a world that was closing in with only ghosts for company. Cain was offering her a cage, but out there in the unforgiving wilderness was a freedom that was just as terrifying as his proposal. Abigail found her father, Elias Thorne, in the barn. The air inside was stale, with the scent of old hay and defeat. He was staring at the empty stalls, a half-empty bottle of whiskey dangling from his limp hand. The setting sun cast long, accusatory fingers of light through the cracks in the wooden walls, striping him like a prisoner in his own home. He was here, Abigail said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. Jedediah Cain. Elias flinched, the movement so sharp he nearly dropped the bottle. He wouldn't meet her eyes. What did he want? He mumbled his words, slurred. What he always wants. She shot back, the anger she had suppressed on the porch now boiling to the surface. The ranch. And me. He laid out his terms. Our salvation for my hand in marriage. Her father finally turned to look at her, and what she saw in his eyes wasn't just the dull glaze of drink. It was fear. A deep, primal terror that went beyond bankruptcy. It was the terror of a man haunted by something far worse than debt. "You can't marry him, Abby," he whispered, his voice cracking. "You can't." A bitter, humorless laugh escaped Abigail's lips. "And what other choice have you left me? Why does he have this hold over you, Papa? It's more than the money, isn't it? I've seen the way you look when his name is mentioned. You look like a man staring at his own hangman." Elias sagged against a support beam, the strength gone from his legs. He slid down to the dusty floor, the whiskey bottle clanking against the wood. He knows, Abby. He knows what happened. What happened where she pressed, kneeling in front of him, forcing him to look at her. What are you so afraid of? His eyes, bloodshot and swimming with regret, finally focused on hers. Crimson Creek, he choked out the name. 10 years ago. It wasn't a battle. It was a slaughter. Abigail felt a cold dread seep into her bones. She'd heard whispers of the Crimson Creek massacre, a skirmish the official reports called it, a necessary action to pacify a rogue Apache band that had been raiding settlements. But the whispers in the saloons told a different story, one of women and children cut down of an unprovoked attack on a peaceful camp. "You were there?" she asked, her voice trembling. He nodded, a single tear, tracing a path through the grime on his cheek. "I was younger then, full of fire and vinegar. Cain, he was the ringleader. He'd lost some cattle, and he convinced a dozen of us that the band at the creek was responsible. He plied us with liquor and promises of glory. We rode in at dawn. They weren't warriors, Abby. They were families. Old men, women, children." The confession tumbled out of him, a torrent of guilt held back for a decade. He spoke of the screams, the confusion, the terrible, bloody work. He hadn't fired the first shot, but he hadn't stopped it either. He had stood by, paralyzed by horror and his own cowardice, as Jedediah Cain and his men enacted their butchery. "Cain holds it over me." Elias rasped, his body shaking with violent shudders. "He says if I ever cross him, he'll see me swing for it. He has letters I wrote, boasting. Oh God, boasting about it. He's been bleeding me dry for years, taking my land piece by piece, and now he wants you. To seal it all. To own the last thing I have left. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Cain's power wasn't just financial, it was absolute. He held her father's life in his hands. And this was his checkmate. There was a boy, Elias, whispered his gaze, distant, fixed on a horror only he could see. Maybe 12, 13 years old. He slipped away during the chaos, hid in the rocks. I saw him. Our eyes met. The hatred in them. It could have set the whole canyon ablaze. They said he was the chief's son. The only one who got away. Abigail's blood ran cold. Who was he? Elias Thorne looked at his daughter, his face a mask of utter despair. They called his band the Tweezy Lani, the Many Goats Clan. The boy's name. They called him Nantan Lupan, the Grey Wolf, the feared Apache, the ghost of the canyons. He wasn't just a legend whispered in fear. He was the sole survivor of the massacre her father had participated in, the one orchestrated by the man who now wanted to be her husband. Nantan Lupan wasn't a phantom haunting the mountains. He was a living, breathing consequence. A man whose entire world had been destroyed by Elias Thorne and Jedediah Cain. Abigail rose to her feet, stumbling backward. She was trapped not just by debt but by blood. Marry the monster who orchestrated the slaughter, or watch her father hang for his part in it all, while living under the shadow of the man who had every right in the world to seek vengeance against them both. She looked at her father, a pathetic, broken figure, weeping in the dust of his own failure. She felt a flicker of pity, but it was quickly extinguished by a wave of cold, hard clarity. He hadn't protected her. He had sacrificed her piece by piece to keep his own terrible secret buried. She was just the final payment on a debt of blood he could never repay. Abigail didn't run. That would have been too simple, too clean. She simply saddled her mare Willow, a stubborn grey, with more sense than most men she knew, and rode out. She didn't ride west toward the false promise of California, or east toward the life she'd left behind. She rode north, straight into the teeth of the Dragoon Mountains. She wasn't seeking death, nor was she seeking escape. She was seeking a moment of silence, a single breath, where she wasn't being suffocated by the sins of her father, or the lecherous gaze of Jedediah Cain. The higher she climbed, the more the air thinned, cleansed of the lowland dust and despair. The landscape grew wilder, more primal. Towering sentinels of saguaro gave way to gnarled junipers and sharp-edged granite. This was a land that didn't care for deeds or debts. It demanded respect and punished foolishness. Abigail was being foolish. She knew it. The sky, a placid blue when she set out, had turned a bruised purple at the edges. The wind picked up whispering through the canyons like a warning. She ignored it. She pushed Willow harder, her mind a maelstrom of rage and grief. The storm broke with the sudden violence of an ambush. One moment the air was still, the next the heavens tore open. Rain came down not in drops but in solid wind-driven sheets that stole her breath and blinded her. The trail, little more than a deer path, dissolved into a slick, treacherous river of mud. Willow, spooked by a sudden crack of thunder that sounded like the mountains themselves, splitting apart, reared violently. Abigail, an expert rider since childhood, was caught off guard. Her hands, slick with rain, lost their grip on the reins. For a heart-stopping second, she was suspended between the sky and the earth, and then she was falling. Her head struck a rock with a sickening final-sounding thud. The world exploded into a starburst of white-hot pain, and then spiraled into a silent, welcoming darkness. She awoke to a world of grey. The rain had softened to a drizzle, and a thick mist clung to the canyon floor, muffling all sound. Her head throbbed with a deep, percussive rhythm that matched her heartbeat. She tried to sit up, but a sharp, stabbing pain in her left leg sent her gasping back to the muddy ground. A quick fumbling touch revealed the problem. Her ankle was twisted at an unnatural angle, already swelling to twice its normal size. Willow was gone. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the fog of her pain. She was alone, injured, and miles from any help. She was going to die here. The thought was strangely calm, a quiet acceptance after the storm of her emotions. She lay there for what could have been minutes or hours, drifting in and out of consciousness, the cold seeping deep into her bones. Then through the mist a shape emerged. It was silent, moving with a fluid grace that seemed impossible in the treacherous terrain. It was not a deer nor a coyote. It was a man. He was tall and lean, with the whipcord strength of someone who lived in harmony with the harsh land. His black hair was long held back by a simple leather band. His face was all sharp angles and hard planes, his skin the color of burnished copper. But it was his eyes that held her captive. They were dark, intense, and held a profound stillness, an ancient sorrow that seemed to see right through her into the broken places she kept hidden. He wore buckskin leggings and a simple tunic, and carried no rifle she could see, only a knife at his belt. He stopped a few feet away, his expression unreadable. Abigail's heart hammered against her ribs. Every horror story she had ever heard about the Apache flooded her mind. This was no ordinary native. The set of his jaw, the regal calm of his posture, the sheer, potent presence of him, it could only be one person. Nantan Lupan. Her breath caught in her throat. She had ridden straight into the wolf's den. This was it. The vengeance her father had feared for a decade was about to be enacted upon her. She scrambled backward, pushing herself with her good leg, the pain in her ankle flaring. The man watched her pathetic attempt to flee without a word. He took a slow step forward. Abigail squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the knife for the end. But it didn't come. Instead, she felt a surprising gentleness. He knelt beside her, his movements economical and precise. He reached not for his knife, but for her injured leg. She flinched, but his grip was firm, impersonal like a physician's. His long, calloused fingers probed the swelling around her ankle, his touch surprisingly knowing. He looked at her truly, looked at her for the first time. His dark eyes held no malice, no overt threat. There was curiosity, perhaps, and something else. A weariness that seemed as old as the mountains themselves. He spoke, and his voice was not the guttural growl of the savages from the dime novels. It was low and raspy, as if from disuse, the words heavily accented but clear. "You are far from your home, white woman," he said. It was not a question, but a statement of fact. He then shifted his attention back to her ankle. With a swift, powerful movement that caught her completely by surprise, he reset the bone. The pain was excruciating, a bolt of pure agony that tore a scream from her throat before she mercifully blacked out once more. When she came to again, the mist had thinned. Her ankle was tightly bound with strips of his own tunic, splinted with 2 straight branches. Nantan Lupan was building a small, smokeless fire a few feet away, his back to her. He had saved her. The ghost of Crimson Creek, the man with every reason to hate her kind, to leave her for the coyotes, had shown her a mercy she had no right to expect. As he turned, and his dark, fathomless eyes met hers, Abigail Thorne knew that whatever came next, it would not be the story anyone had ever told her. The world for Abigail shrank to the size of a small, hidden encampment nestled in a box canyon. It was a place the land itself, seemed to protect, accessible only through a narrow, winding passage masked by a curtain of ancient junipers. Nantan carried her there with an unnerving ease, his stride sure and steady over terrain she would have struggled with on 2 good feet. The camp was not what she expected. There were no crude teepees or scattered debris. It was a place of Spartan order. A lean-to built against a sheer rock face provided shelter its roof, a clever weave of yucca and pine boughs. A few clay pots, a worn wool blanket, and a small collection of tools were arranged with meticulous care. This was not the lair of a wild beast. It was the home of a man who lived with deliberation. The first few days were a blur of pain and feverish sleep. Nantan tended to her with a detached efficiency that was both comforting and unsettling. He would appear silently, with a bowl of thin, savory broth made from rabbit and wild herbs, or a cup of bitter tea that eased her fever. He would check the splint on her ankle, his touch always firm and clinical, before disappearing again for hours at a time, leaving her alone with her thoughts and the vast, intimidating silence of the canyon. He rarely spoke. Communication was a language of gesture and necessity. When she shivered, a blanket appeared. When her water skin was empty, it was refilled from a hidden spring. She learned to read the subtle shifts in his posture, the slight narrowing of his eyes, the almost imperceptible tilt of his head. He was a man who observed everything, who moved through the world with a quiet intensity that made the boisterous confidence of men like Jedediah Cain seem clownish and hollow. Abigail, in turn, became a student of his life. She watched him tan a deer hide, using techniques passed down through generations, his hands working with an ingrained, rhythmic knowledge. She saw him track the sun's passage across the canyon wall to tell the time. She listened as he mimicked the call of a hawk with such perfection that its mate answered from the sky above. He was not just surviving in this wilderness. He was a part of it, as much as the rock and the juniper and the eagle. Slowly, as her fever broke and the throbbing in her ankle subsided to a dull ache, the fear she'd felt began to curdle into a complex mix of curiosity and a grudging respect. Everything she had been taught about the Apache, that they were godless, bloodthirsty savages, crumbled in the face of this silent, dignified man. He was the most solitary person she had ever met, yet he did not seem lonely. He seemed complete, self-contained, his grief a part of him, yes, but not the entirety of him. One afternoon, as she sat propped against a rock, carving a piece of cottonwood with a small knife he had given her to pass the time, he returned from a hunt with 2 rabbits slung over his shoulder. He stopped before her, and for the first time initiated a conversation that went beyond immediate needs. The carving, he said, nodding toward the piece of wood. "You make a bird." Abigail looked down at the crude shape in her hands. A dove, she clarified her voice, rusty. "My mother used to say they were messengers of peace." He considered this for a long moment, his dark eyes unreadable. "There is no peace in this land," he said, his voice flat. "Only places to hide." The statement hung in the air between them, stark and true. He was talking about himself, she knew, but he was also talking about her. She too had been hiding, trapped on a dying ranch, cowering from a future she didn't want. "Why did you help me?" she asked, the question that had been burning in her mind since she first awoke in his presence. "My people. We—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "We murdered your family." Nantan set down the rabbits and began to skin one with his knife, his movements fluid and practiced. He did not look at her as he spoke. When the she-wolf is caught in the snare, the hunter can kill her, or he can let her go. He does not ask the snare Its opinion, he said. You were caught. I saw it. It was a strange, cryptic answer, but Abigail understood. He hadn't seen a white woman an enemy. He had seen a creature in a trap, and his instinct, whatever his history had been, to offer aid, not violence. The simplicity of it was staggering. In her world, every action was transactional, a calculation of debt and gain. In his, it seemed, some things were just done. As the sun began to set, painting the canyon walls in hues of orange, and rows of fragile truce settled between them. They were not friends, not yet. They were two solitary souls from warring worlds brought together by a storm and a shared understanding of what it meant to be trapped. He was the feared Apache warrior, the ghost of Crimson Creek. She was the daughter of one of his family's killers. And yet, in the quiet sanctuary of his hidden canyon, they were simply a man and a woman, beginning to see past the labels the world had given them and glimpse the person underneath. Her strength returned with the slow patience of a desert sunrise. Soon, Abigail could put weight on her ankle, and with the aid of a sturdy branch Nantan Lupan had fashioned into a crutch, she began to explore the confines of their canyon sanctuary. Each step was a small victory, a reclaiming of her own body and will. He watched her progress with his usual quiet observation, never offering help, unless she faltered, allowing her the dignity of her own recovery. The days settled into a rhythm that was both timeless and healing. The physical world, so long a source of hardship and despair, became a source of wonder. Nantan Lupan showed her which plants could be eaten, which roots could be ground into medicine, and which berries were sweet poison. He taught her how to read the stories left in the dust, the delicate tracks of a quail, the heavy tread of a wandering bear, the slither of a sidewinder. He was teaching her his language, not of words, but of the earth itself. In return, she offered him pieces of her world. She told him stories from the books her mother had loved, tales of faraway kings and ocean voyages. She sang old sad folk songs her father had taught her in his better years, her voice soft in the vast silence of the canyon. He would listen, his head tilted, his expression betraying nothing yet. She felt he was absorbing every word, every note, storing them away in the quiet chambers of his heart. The unspoken tension between them began to change. The distance was no longer that of captor and captive or patient and healer. It was the charged space between two people who were intensely aware of one another, a man and a woman who had seen the deepest vulnerabilities in each other. She saw the profound loneliness in his solitary rituals. He saw the caged spirit behind her proper, civilized manners. One night the air grew cold with the promise of autumn. The fire Nantan Lupan built crackled and spat, casting their faces in a flickering, intimate glow. The moon was a sharp silver sliver in a sea of stars, more brilliant than any she had ever seen. The immensity of the cosmos above and the deep quiet of their canyon below seemed to strip away all pretense, leaving only the raw truth. Abigail found herself speaking of her life before the storm, the words pouring out of her in a hushed, desperate torrent. She spoke of her mother's death, her father's slow, agonizing decline into a ghost haunted by his past, and the suffocating bargain offered by Jedediah Kane. "He wants to own me," she whispered, hugging her knees to her chest, the firelight glinting in her tear-filled eyes. "To him I'm no different from a prize mare or a piece of land. Something to be acquired. My father sees me as the price of his atonement, a sacrifice to appease the man who holds his sins over his head. They both speak of protecting me, of giving me a future, but neither of them has ever asked what I want." A tear escaped, tracing a hot path down her cheek. The grief and rage she had held inside for so long finally broke free. "All my life, I have been a daughter, a potential wife, a commodity. I have been dutiful. I have been obedient. I have been so alone." Her voice cracked, breaking on a sob that seemed to tear itself from the very depths of her soul. She looked across the fire at the still silent man watching her, his face a mask of stone in the dancing light. "I have never known love." She cried the words a raw, painful admission. Only duty and fear, and the cold weight of obligation. The silence that followed was absolute. The crackling of the fire seemed to fade away. Nantan Lupan's gaze did not waver. He had listened to every word, his dark eyes absorbing her pain. He had heard the truth. She spoke a truth that resonated with his own story of loss and isolation. His world had been taken from him by force. Hers had been slowly squeezed to death by the pretense of civilization. But the result was the same, a heart that had been starved of true affection. Slowly, deliberately, he rose from his seat on a flat rock and crossed the small space between them. He knelt before her in the dirt, so close she could feel the warmth radiating from him. He did not touch her. He simply looked at her, his eyes holding a universe of sorrow, of understanding, of a strength she could only guess at. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, resonant murmur, a sound that seemed to come from the very earth beneath them. It was devoid of pity, but full of a profound, soul-deep empathy. "Then I will give you all of mine." It was not a boast. It was not a lover's sweet promise. It was a statement of fact, as solid and real as the granite walls surrounding them. It was the offering of a man who had lost everything, a man whose heart had been hollowed out by grief, and who had found in this broken woman from his enemy's world a reason to fill it again. He was offering her the fierce, undiluted love of a man who had nothing left to give but the entirety of his own being, his protection, his loyalty, his knowledge, his very soul. In that moment, Abigail saw him completely. Not the feared Apache, not the ghost of vengeance, but a man whose capacity for love was as vast and untamed as the land he called home. And as he finally reached out and gently wiped the tears from her cheek with his thumb, she did not flinch. She leaned into his touch, a silent acceptance of a gift she never knew she was worthy of. While a fragile new world was being built in the hidden canyon, the old one was churning with rage. Jedediah Cain was not a man who tolerated being thwarted. Abigail's disappearance was not just an inconvenience, it was a public insult. His property, for he already considered her as such, had been stolen from him. He stormed into the office of Marshal Wyatt Gibson in Tombstone, his face florid with fury. "She's been taken," he bellowed, slamming a meaty fist on the marshal's desk. "Abigail Thorne. Vanished 2 days ago. It's the Apache Gibson. It has to be that phantom Nantan Lupan." Marshal Gibson, a man who had seen enough of Cain's bluster to be unimpressed by it, leaned back in his chair. "You got any proof of that, Jedediah? Or are you just looking for an excuse to stir up trouble on the reservation border?" "Proof," Cain sputtered. "A decent God-fearing white woman disappears into the dragoons, and you need proof he's been haunting those hills for a decade, a ghost looking for revenge. He's taken her for his squaw. We need to form a posse and hunt him down like the dog he is." Cain was a master manipulator. He knew which fears to stoke, which prejudices to ignite. He didn't wait for the marshal's official sanction. He went straight to the saloons, buying rounds of whiskey and spinning a lurid tale of a savage buck defiling a helpless white flower. It was a story as old as the frontier itself, and just as effective. Men bored with their lives and thirsty for blood and glory were quick to sign on. They weren't interested in justice. They were interested in a hunt. But Cain's motives ran deeper than rescuing a bride or avenging a slight. Nantan Lupun was the last living witness to the Crimson Creek massacre. For 10 years he had been a ghost story, a whisper. But if he was bold enough to take Abigail, he might be bold enough to talk. If the true story of that day ever came out, Cain's empire of respectability would crumble, and he could well end up at the end of a rope. He wasn't just hunting for Abigail, he was hunting to silence the past forever. His first stop was the Thorn Ranch. He found Elias in a state of near catatonia, rocking in his chair, staring at the mountains. "Your daughter's been taken, old man." Cain snarled, dispensing with any pretense of sympathy. That redskin ghost finally came for his due. "I'm raising a posse to get her back and finish what we started 10 years ago." Elias looked up, his eyes wide, with a fresh, more immediate terror. Not for himself, but for Abigail. He had imagined Nantan Lupan's vengeance as a knife in his own back in the dead of night. He had never considered that it would fall on his daughter. "No," Elias whispered. "You can't. You don't know. I know we have a savage to kill, and a woman to save. Cain cut him off. You're coming with us. You know these hills better than anyone. You'll help us track him." It was not a request. Cain's eyes bored into Elias, a silent reminder of the letters, the secrets, the gallows that awaited him if he refused. Trapped by his own history, Elias Thorne felt the noose tighten. He would be forced to hunt the very man his sins had created, and in doing so, lead a lynch mob to his own daughter's doorstep. Meanwhile, in the canyon, Nantan Lupan knew. He didn't need to see the posse to feel its presence. He read it in the flight of a startled hawk, in the unnatural silence of the coyotes, in the tense energy that hummed through the land itself. The white men were coming. They were moving in a pack, clumsy and loud, their anger a foul scent on the wind. He found Abigail by the spring, watching her test her full weight on her ankle. It was nearly healed. "They are coming," he said without preamble. "A dozen men, maybe more. Led by the one you call Cain." Abigail's face went pale. The sanctuary they had built was about to be invaded, desecrated. "How do you know the mountain told me?" he answered simply. "They hunt you. They hunt me. They use your name as the reason, but their goal is my death." He looked at her, his gaze steady. "We must leave this place. We can go north into the Chiricahua wilderness. They will never find us there." It was the sensible choice, to run, to disappear, to preserve the fragile life they had just begun to imagine. But as Abigail looked at him, she saw the deep weariness in his eyes. He had been running, hiding for 10 years. Crimson Creek was a wound that had never been allowed to heal, and Cain was the poison that kept it festering. "No," Abigail said, her voice shaking but firm. She was no longer the frightened girl who had fled into the storm. The woman who stood before him had been tempered by the wilderness and transformed by his quiet strength. "If we run, he will never stop hunting you. And my father, he is trapped with him. This won't end until the truth is brought into the light." A dangerous, terrifying idea began to form in her mind, an idea born of desperation and a newfound courage. "You said there is no peace in this land," she said, her eyes locking with his. "Maybe peace isn't something you find. Maybe it's something you have to make." Nantan Lupan saw the resolve in her face, the fire in her eyes. She was not suggesting they run. She was suggesting they fight. Not with an army, but with the one weapon they had, that Jedediah Cain feared more than anything, the truth. "He will not listen to reason," Nantan Lupan warned. "He comes for blood." Then we won't give him the battle he wants." Abigail declared, her mind racing. "We'll give him a reckoning." She looked around the canyon at the place that had been her refuge, and then her gaze turned southward toward the dark history that bound all of them together. "We have to go back to where it all began, to Crimson Creek." Crimson Creek was a boneyard of memories. Even after a decade of sun and wind, the place felt wounded. The rocks themselves seemed stained with a sorrow that the elements could not scour away. The cottonwood trees that lined the dry, dusty creek bed grew in a somber stillness, their leaves whispering on the afternoon breeze, not with the rustle of life, but with the hushed, mournful cadence of a dirge. This was a place of ghosts, a natural amphitheater for a tragedy, and it was here, on this desecrated ground, that Nantan Lupan chose to set his stage. It was a choice born of profound tactical and spiritual knowledge. He knew every rock that could hide a man, every ravine that could swallow a sound, every shadow that the setting sun would soon stretch into a deceptive veil. He was not preparing for a battle. He was orchestrating a revelation. High above the basin floor, nestled in a defensible crevice, concealed by a gnarled juniper, Abigail waited. She had a rifle across her lap, not for a fight, but as a symbol of her changed state. She was no longer a pawn, but a player. From her vantage point, she could see the entire scene unfold. Below Nantan Lupan, melted into the landscape, becoming an unseen, unheard presence, the very ghost the white men had claimed him to be. The posse entered the basin in the late afternoon. The sun, beginning its slow descent, bled across the western sky, casting long, distorted shadows that turned familiar shapes into monstrous illusions. The 20 men led by Jedediah Kane had started their ride with swagger and whiskey-fueled bravado. Now entering the profound, eerie silence of the canyon, their confidence had withered. They were jumpy, their eyes darting nervously from shadow to shadow. The stories of this place and of the man they hunted suddenly felt far too real. "He's here," Kane said, his voice a low growl that failed to conceal his own tension. "I can feel the devil's presence. Beside him, Elias Thorne looked like a man riding toward his own gallows, his face ashen, his hands trembling on the reins. He recognized every stone, and each one was an accuser. "Spread out!" Kane commanded, his authority sounding hollow in the vast emptiness. "Flush him out. I want him alive if you can manage it. I want him to watch me take back the woman he stole." The men dismounted their boots, crunching in the gravel with a sound that was unnervingly loud. They moved forward in a loose, hesitant line, rifles held at the ready. They were hunters, not soldiers, and this felt less like a hunt and more like walking into a trap. Suddenly, a voice echoed through the basin, seeming to come from the rocks, the sky, and the very ground beneath their feet. "You desecrate this ground again, Jedediah Kane." The men froze, spinning in place, their rifles sweeping across the empty landscape. They saw nothing. Nantan Lupan's voice, calm and resonant, was a disembodied force. "You told these men you came to rescue a woman. You told them I am a savage who stole her away for my own lust." The voice paused, letting the words hang in the air. "Ask yourselves," it continued now, seeming to come from a different direction, "why a man would bring 20 rifles to rescue one woman." A murmur of unease rippled through the posse. Kane's face contorted his eyes, scanning the rocks with frantic rage. "Show yourself, you coward. Stop hiding in the shadows and face us like a man. Like you faced my father, the chief who came to you with open hands," the voice answered, laced with a cold, cutting irony. "Like you faced the women who were mending blankets. The children who were playing in this creek, was that facing them like a man? Cain, he's lying, trying to twist your minds. Cain roared, his composure shattering. He's a murderer and a devil. At that moment, Abigail chose her stage. She rose from her hiding place and stepped into the open on a high, wide ledge. The late sun caught her, framing her in a halo of golden light. She stood tall, her hair unbound, the rifle held loosely at her side. He is telling the truth. Her voice, clear and strong, rang through the canyon, silencing every man below. It was a voice they did not recognize, not the timid Miss Thorne from the failing ranch, but a woman of formidable presence. A collective gasp went through the posse. They stared, slack-jawed. She was not harmed. She was not crying. She was not a victim. "Abigail!" Cain shouted, a raw note of panic in his voice. "He's bewitched you! Get away from him! I've come to save you! You've never wanted to save anyone but yourself. Jedediah!" She called back, her gaze sweeping over the posse, meeting the eyes of men she had known her whole life. "He didn't kidnap me. He saved me. Your stories are lies built on a foundation of blood and murder. You want the truth? Ask my father. He stands among you. He was here 10 years ago. Weren't you Papa?" Every eye, every rifle turned to Elias Thorne. He sat frozen on his horse, trapped in the crossfire of his past and his daughter's future. He saw Cain's murderous glare, promising a hangman's noose. He saw his daughter's pleading eyes, offering a painful, terrifying path to redemption. He saw Nantan Lupan step out from behind a towering rock formation, not with a weapon raised, but standing with a quiet, powerful dignity. His dark eyes were fixed on Elias, not with hatred, but with a gaze that simply asked for the truth to be spoken. The dam of a decade's worth of guilt, fear, and self-loathing finally burst within Elias Thorne. The faces of the dead from that morning, the old woman with the kind eyes, the small boy with the wooden horse, flashed before his eyes. He could no longer bear the weight of their ghosts. With a strangled cry, he slid from his horse, his legs giving way, and collapsed to his knees in the dusty creek bed. "It's true," he choked out the confession, a ragged, sobbing torrent. "All of it. It was a massacre. Cain told us they were raiders, but they were families, peaceful people." He raised his head, his face a mess of tears and dust. We slaughtered them. I saw it. I saw this man." He gestured a trembling hand toward Nantan Lupan. "As a boy, watch his whole world burn. And I did nothing. God forgive me, I stood and did nothing." The confession landed with the force of a physical blow. The posse was stunned into silence, the ugly truth laid bare. They looked at Cain, their faces shifting from confusion to dawning horror, then to cold disgust. He was not a leader. He was a monster. Realizing he was utterly exposed, his empire of lies reduced to rubble, Cain's mind snapped. With a primal roar of pure rage, he wrenched the pistol from his hip. But he didn't aim for Nantan Lupan, the ghost of his past. He aimed for Elias Thorne, the man whose weakness had just become his ruin. Time seemed to slow. Abigail screamed. The posse was too shocked to react. But Nantan Lupan moved with the fluid, impossible speed of a striking hawk. He had shown no weapon, but he was never unarmed. In 2 silent strides, he closed the distance. A long-bladed knife appeared in his hand. There was a flash of steel in the fading light, not a killing thrust, but a precise, intricate movement. The knife didn't cut flesh, but struck the pistol's trigger guard, the shock and force of the blow, sending the gun flying from Cain's grasp as his fingers went numb. Nantan Lupan stood over the whimpering, disarmed cattle baron. The posse tensed rifles, half raising, expecting the final bloody act of vengeance. This was it. The moment of justice, 10 years in the making. But Nantan Lupan simply looked down at the pathetic defeated man at his feet, his breath fogging in the cooling air. The hatred that had fueled him for a decade had burned away, leaving behind only a vast, empty calm. Killing this shell of a man would not restore his family. It would only make him a party to the same cycle of violence. He straightened, turning his back on Cain in a gesture of ultimate dismissal, and faced the men of the posse. "His justice is not mine to give," he said, his voice quiet, but carrying in the stillness. "It is for your laws. Take him." He then walked to where Elias Thorne still knelt, weeping in the dirt. He looked down at the broken man, the man who had been his witness and his tormentor. He extended a hand, not in anger, not in triumph, but in an offering of something far more profound: release. Elias stared at the outstretched hand, the hand of the man whose life he had helped to destroy. Trembling, he reached up and took it. As Nantan Lupan pulled him to his feet, a decade of haunting finally came to an end, not with the satisfying crack of a gunshot, but with a quiet, incomprehensible act of grace. The ghosts of Crimson Creek were finally at peace. The story of Abigail Thorne and Nantan Lupan didn't end with the setting sun at Crimson Creek. It began there. Jedediah Cain was taken to Tombstone, his crimes laid bare by the testimony of a dozen men who had ridden out as a posse and returned as witnesses. Elias Thorne faced his own trial, but his confession, his profound remorse, and the public testimony of the very man he had wronged earned him a measure of mercy. He lost his ranch, but he regained his soul. For Abigail and Nantan Lupan, the path forward was not easy. They were a bridge between two worlds that did not want to be connected, facing down prejudice and suspicion from all sides. But their love forged not in ballrooms or whispered promises, but in the crucible of survival, truth and mutual respect was stronger than any hatred. They took what remained of the Thorne legacy and built something new, a place of peace on the edge of the wild, a testament to the idea that love is not about finding a perfect person, but about seeing an imperfect person perfectly. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the heart of the Old West. If this story of courage, truth, and unexpected love moved you, please show your support. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who appreciates a powerful story, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more tales from the untamed frontier. Your support allows us to keep these histories and the powerful human emotions within them alive. Click subscribe now, and we'll see you for the next story.